Edmund Hillary was the stereotypical country bumpkin. Hailing from rural New Zealand, the shy, gangly beekeeper stepped out of the shadows to take on one of the greatest physical challenges of them all, climbing the world's highest mountain. Through guts, grit, and determination, he managed to, as he famously said, knock the bastard off. From there, he used his newfound fame as a platform to improve the lives of the Nepalese people who he had developed an affinity for, leaving behind a legacy that endures beyond the record books. In today's Biographics, we look at the life and the accomplishments of the first man to ever climb Mount Everest, Sir Edmund Hillary. Edmund Percival Hillary was born on July 20th, 1919 in Auckland, New Zealand. Shortly after the birth of his father, Percival Augustus was allocated a land grant in recognition of his service during the First World War. As a result, the family, which included 3-year-old June, moved south to the farming settlement of Tapuaenuku. A younger brother, Rex, soon came along. June later described the three boys as follows: Ed had the brains, Rex had the looks, and I was the girl. According to Ed's own recollections, it was his mother who held the family together. She managed the money and made sure that the kids were okay. This was no easy task. The Hillary children had an adventurous streak that saw them pushing everything to the limit. Once, Ed and Rex swapped bicycles, with Ed riding on the one that was too small for him. Rex, however, found it hard to control the larger bike. Still, knowing that Ed would be chasing him, he went as fast as he could. Turning a corner, he collided with a car, bouncing off the bonnet and then bouncing off the road. The driver was terrified that he had killed Rex, but Ed was merely terrified of the beating he knew his father would give him when he saw the state of the bike. Although Percy was a pacifist, he was prone to fits of rage. These bursts of rage, they were usually directed at his oldest son. Even though he feared the beatings, the stubborn Ed was determined to never give his father the satisfaction of admitting that he had done anything wrong. Despite the competitive bond with his brother, Ed's early years, they were filled with loneliness. Throughout his primary years, he didn't make any friends. While other kids were out playing, he filled his time with extra tuition, which allowed him to enter high school 2 years ahead of his peers. This only made his social situation worse, though. He was now shorter and younger than all the other kids. High school meant that he had to take the train to the prestigious Auckland grammar school and rub shoulders with the children of the wealthy. This intensified his lack of self-confidence and social awkwardness even further. In his later years, Ed often recounted an incident that occurred during his first week at Auckland Grammar that had a deep impact on him. He turned up for his first gym class along with his classmates. The teacher surveyed his new students and then, fixing his gaze on Ed, said, "What have they sent me?" He then went on to catalogue a long list of what he saw was wrong with Ed. Finally, he told the humiliated boy to go against the wall with the other misfits. Ed recalls that this incident marked the beginning of a sense of inferiority about his looks, which would remain with him for the rest of his life. Ed found the companionship that he lacked with other humans in books. After wading through the typical teenage literary attractions of the day, such as Edgar Rice Burroughs and H. Rider Haggard, he discovered books on mountaineering. They fascinated him, and he devoured everything on the subject that he could get his hands on. Percy ran the local newspaper in the town and had a sideline business as a beekeeper. In 1935, Ed's last year at Auckland Grammar, the family moved to the inner Auckland suburb of Remuera. Beekeeping now became the family's main source of income. The change meant that Ed no longer had to spend hours on the train every single day. From college, Ed went on to the University of Auckland, where he studied mathematics and science. He also joined the University Tramping Club. With his long stride and his abundant stamina, he soon became a star bushwalker. He also took lessons in boxing and jiu-jitsu, but head-to-head combat wasn't his style. In 1938, Ed, who had been struggling academically, dropped out of university and joined his father in the beekeeping business. His stamina, endurance, and physical strength were ideally suited for the job. It was hot, physically demanding work, and in the summer he would carry out his duties wearing only shorts, a hat, and a veil. Every day he would have to endure up to 300 bee stings. Not long after Ed began working on the bee farm, his parents converted to a New Age religious movement called Radiant Living. The group had beliefs that were not far removed from those of Christian Scientists. Ed and his brother Rex, they soon became converts too. When war broke out in 1939, it appeared inevitable that both Hillary boys would be drafted into the New Zealand Armed Services. But Percy, the pacifist, was determined to prevent this from happening. He managed to get himself and Ed off the hook by relying on a provision that allowed exemptions for reserved occupations, including beekeeping. However, Percy did all of this without telling Ed, who was not happy to hear about his father's meddling. Percy soon discovered that only one exemption per family was allowed. Ed's exemption meant that Rex would have to go to war. It just so happened, though, that Rex, unlike Ed, was a conscientious objector. Ed would have been happy to sign up, but Rex wasn't. He followed his conscience and spent the next 4 years in a detention camp. For 3 years, Ed fumed silently that his father had prevented him from fulfilling what he saw as his patriotic duty. Finally, in 1944, he joined the Royal New Zealand Air Force. It was during his training as a flight navigator in New Zealand's South Island that Ed encountered towering mountains. He managed to get in a few solo climbs. Then he came across the 2,884-meter snow-capped Mount Tapuaenuku. He became determined to make an ascent and arranged for a 3-day leave. He arranged to climb the mountain with a partner, but the man pulled out at the last minute. Ed decided to go it alone, with a friend taking him part of the way on his motorbike. He then walked 8 kilometers to a farm where he stayed overnight. The next day, he walked another 24 kilometers, overnighted at another farm, and then set off up the mountain. He reached the top without any trouble, and he returned safely. The next day, he walked another 32 kilometers before receiving a lift. Ed was delighted with this first experience. He had knocked off his first mountain, and it felt great. Returning to his war service, Ed found himself stationed to the Pacific Islands. Years later, he would recall coming across a small Fijian boy who came up and begged for a piece of bread. Experiences like this formed the catalyst for his great humanitarian work that he would pursue later in life. Ed, he never came near combat, though he did contract malaria. His war also nearly ended in disaster when a full petrol tank in his plane fell and burst into flames. The plane came down into the ocean. Before Ed, who was not wearing a shirt, could jump clear of the blazing craft, a wave knocked him off his feet and he fell into the flames. He then managed to roll off the plane and into the sea. Ed suffered second-degree burns, and the pain was made worse by him having to swim 450 meters and then walk 800 meters under the blazing sun before he reached help. He was taken to a hospital in Guadalcanal where he was shot full of morphine and antibiotics. He was told that he would be in bed for months before he could achieve a full recovery. However, within 2 weeks, he was up and walking about. He became so restless and so bored that he begged his doctors to allow him to recover at home in Auckland. They finally relented and he was discharged from the Air Force and sent home. When Ed got home, he didn't intend to lie around, but rather get to work. For when he discovered that his father had taken on other workers and had no opening for him on the bee farm, he moved to the South Island in search of new opportunities. He joined the New Zealand Alpine Club, and over the next couple of years, he learned the climber's craft as he took on many of the mountainous peaks of the South Island. Ed climbed with others, but he always wanted to be the first to the top. In 1949, older sister June got married. Percy had enjoyed an especially good honey season, and he paid for Ed to travel with his parents to Europe. Ed took every opportunity to take on European peaks, including the Eiger. While he was in Europe, Ed received a letter from a former climbing partner by the name of George Lowe, informing him that plans were underway of a New Zealand party to undertake a trek of the Himalayas. They intended to explore the possibility of tackling the world's highest peak, Mount Everest, something that had never been done successfully before. Lowe, he wanted to know whether Hillary was interested. The answer, well, as you might imagine, it was an unequivocal yes. In mountaineering terms, there was no greater challenge than a successful ascent of Mount Everest, which towers 8,848 meters from the ground. Many climbers had died trying to get there, most famously the British climber George Mallory in 1924. A turning point in the history of attempts on Everest occurred in 1950 when the Nepalese government agreed to allow parties to attempt the mountain from Nepal on the southern side. Previous expeditions had attacked from Tibet on the northern side of the mountain. The Nepalese government decided to let a different country every year have a go. It just so happened that in addition to the New Zealand group, a party of British climbers were also planning an assault on Everest. The British group sent a letter to the New Zealanders suggesting that they join up. The invitation, however, was only for 2 climbers. The question was now, well, who would go? After some heated discussion, it was decided that Ed, the acknowledged superior climber, and Earle Riddiford would be the token New Zealanders on the British expedition. Rather than a concerted effort to reach the summit, this expedition was more of an exploratory probe. While climbing with Shipton, the expedition leader, Hillary came across a vast hidden valley that appeared to provide a previously unknown route to the top. The group split up and agreed to return the next year. The following year, 1952, however, was assigned to a Swiss expedition attempt to climb Everest. The British, with their New Zealand contingent, they'd have to wait until 1953. Planning the 1953 assault began in a small office in London. It was led by Eric Shipton, who believed that the journey should be made by a small team with basic supplies. But Shipton had only just begun choosing his team when there was a sudden change of plan. Previous attempts to climb Everest by small teams had failed, and it was decided that this time they would use a big team with the latest equipment and plenty of supplies. A new leader, John Hunt, was appointed. In March of 1953, the expedition team began to arrive in Kathmandu. The team got ready to make their way east to the Himalayas and Mount Everest. Hillary was one of 14 climbers and more than 30 Nepalese Sherpas who made up the team. Nearly 400 people set off from Kathmandu on March the 10th. More than 350 of them were locals who were hired to carry supplies to the site for the first camp. For 17 days, they walked through the Nepalese countryside until they arrived at base camp. There, they stayed for 3 weeks, planning the climbs to come. They practiced with their climbing gear on local cliffs and tried to get used to the thin air of the high mountains. In early April, base camp was moved from near Tengboche Monastery to a second main base, the lake camp, higher up by a lake on a glacier. The first big challenge for the leaders came on April the 13th. 4 men, including Hillary, were selected by Hunt to explore a region known as the Khumbu Icefall. This was an area of house-sized blocks of ice that cracked and creaked. The climbers had to find a safe route for the Nepalese Sherpas who were to follow, bringing supplies. A number of camps were set up through the icefall. The lead climbers pressed through the Khumbu Icefall and set up advanced base camp above it. By now, Hillary had impressed all with his boundless energy and exceptional strength. Early on in the morning of April the 26th, Ed teamed up with Sherpa Tenzing Norgay for the first time. Their task was to reach an advance camp that was set up during the previous year's Swiss expedition. Roped together, the 2 men waded through deep slushy snow that had shortened with the sun's rays. Despite being hot and thirsty, the pair worked well together. Arriving at the camp, they found an unexpected treat. The Swiss had left behind some supplies, which included delicious cheese. On the way back to base camp, Hillary boasted to Norgay that he could make it back within an hour. All went well until he decided to leap across a crevasse. He reached the other side, but the edge of the crevasse broke off. Suddenly, he was slipping downwards, and his fate was in the hands of his partner. Fortunately, Norgay was a brilliant climber. He quickly grabbed a hold of the pole and used all of his skill, strength, and experience to help Hillary climb up to the side of the crevasse. Returning to base camp, the bond between the 2 men had been strengthened by Hillary's narrow escape. Hillary wrote to his parents that he and Norgay had become the tigers of the campaign on that day. They had shown strength, courage, and fearlessness, and they hoped that that would take them to the top of Everest. By late May, the lead climbers had scaled the Lhotse face to the South Col, a flat area that is one of the nastiest places on Everest. Here, they set up their 7th camp. This was where they would make their final push to the summit. 2 other climbers were selected to make the first push, but they only made it to the lower South Summit. On the morning of May the 28th, 5 more climbers set off from the South Col. 3 lead climbers were there to cut steps for the 2 men who had been picked to go all the way to the top, Hillary and Tenzing. By nightfall, the helpers had turned back, and now it was up to the 2 of them. Hillary and Tenzing pitched their tent below Everest's south summit on an uneven ice ledge. At 6:30 a.m. on May the 29th, they began their final journey to the summit. While climbing a steep slope, the surface snow shifted, carrying Hillary with it. Then, with their oxygen running low, the 2 men came to a rock face. It was too slippery to try and climb hard rock, and the crampons fitted to their boots. They had to find another way. Hillary saw a cornice attached to a rock. It had started to come away, leaving a crack stretching upwards between the rock and the ice. He crawled into the crack, and grasping the rock in front of him, he pulled himself further in. Jamming his crampons into the ice, he pulled himself through the crack at the top of the cornice and signaled to Norgay to follow. They now continued along the ridge, hoping the summit would come into view. Just as Hillary doubted if they could go on, he looked up and saw a snowy peak that dropped away on all sides. Hillary himself later recalled, "A few more whacks of the ice axe, a few more weary steps, and we were on the summit." It was now time to celebrate, take photographs, and appreciate the best view in the world. The news that Everest had finally been conquered reached the outside world on June the 2nd. Ed was lionized as the beekeeper from rural New Zealand who had done the impossible. From Nepal, he flew to London, where he was appointed a Knight Commander of the British Empire by the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II. He returned to New Zealand as a conquering hero, with thousands flooding the streets to get a glimpse of him. For the awkward and shy young man that he was, this unexpected adulation, it was hard to get used to. A few months after conquering Everest, Hillary made another conquest. He won over and married Louise Mary Rose. This time, however, he needed help. He was so shy that he had to rely on his mother-in-law to propose on his behalf. This union later produced 3 children, Peter, Sarah, and Belinda. Peter would become a climber just like his father, reaching the summit of Everest himself in 1990. Both Hillary and Tenzing continued climbing, with Hillary tackling 10 more Himalayan peaks over the next decade. On January 4, 1958, he led an expedition to Antarctica, following the route of Robert Falcon Scott in 1912. The New Zealanders became the first to make the trek in motorized vehicles, with Ed riding a tractor. Hillary later became an unofficial ambassador for New Zealand. In the 1970s, he commentated on several Air New Antarctic sightseeing flights. On November 28, 1979, he was booked to work on Flight 901, but had to renege due to other work commitments. That flight crashed into a mountain in Antarctica, with everyone on board being killed. As the years went by, Hillary returned increasingly to Nepal. There he became absorbed in programs of fundraising and building work for Sherpa communities. In 1960, he established the Himalayan Trust, which was responsible for the building of many schools and hospitals throughout remote Himalayan areas. Hillary received terrible news, though, in 1975. Tragedy struck, with his wife and daughter Belinda being killed in a plane crash while flying to join him in Nepal. Devastated, Hillary immersed himself in his building work. However, this was becoming increasingly difficult as he was getting more and more altitude sick. Hillary's health deteriorated in the late 1990s. On January 11th, 2008, his heart finally gave out. He died at the Auckland City Hospital from cardiac arrest. His country, they went into mourning, and a state funeral was held on January 22nd. 2 months later, a Thanksgiving service was held in his honor at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Standing guard outside the chapel were Gurkha soldiers from Nepal, showing their respect for a man who had given so much to improve the lot of their people. So I really hope you enjoyed that episode of Biographics. If you did, there's a couple of things you could do right now. One is hit that like button below. Also, if you want more stuff like this, we put out brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday, so hit that subscribe button below. And subscribe button doesn't do what it used to on YouTube. If you actually want to get a notification about these videos, please do hit that bell button next to the subscribe button, and that'll send you a notification every time, every Monday and Thursday when we put out a new video. Also, if you want to watch something else right now, stuff from the archive, over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.